System. In 1852, a 14-year-old girl created a language so sophisticated that 3 plantations spent months trying to decode it. They never succeeded. And by the time they understood what she had built, 47 people had vanished into the night, following words that sounded like nonsense but mapped a path to freedom. Her name was Patience, and she proved that the most powerful weapon against oppression isn't violence, it's intelligence they can't comprehend. If you're drawn to stories of extraordinary minds triumphing over impossible circumstances, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. These are the narratives that textbooks forgot, stories of genius that emerged from the darkest chapters of American history. You won't want to miss what comes next. This is the story of a girl who turned language itself into a weapon, and the system that thought it owned her never understood a single word. The Beaumont plantation sat along the Savannah River in the low country of South Carolina, where the heat pressed down like a physical weight and the air hung thick with moisture 9 months of the year. Rice paddies stretched in geometric patterns toward the horizon, their flooded fields reflecting sky and cloud like broken mirrors scattered across the earth. The main house rose on a slight elevation, white columns visible for miles, a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering. In 1852, Beaumont was home to 112 enslaved people, their lives governed by rhythms of planting and harvest, by the overseer's whistle at dawn and the last bell at dusk. The work was brutal. Rice cultivation required standing in knee-deep water for hours, bodies bent beneath the Carolina sun, hands moving with mechanical precision through mud and stalks. People died young here, their lives measured in harvests rather than years. Among this population was a girl who had arrived 3 years earlier, purchased at auction in Charleston, along with her mother, Dinah. The bill of sale listed her simply as female child, approximately 11 years, sound. Her name, the one her mother had given her, was Patience. And from her first day at Beaumont, she watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. They think we don't see them, Patience thought during those early months, carrying water between the rice fields, her small body straining under the weight of wooden buckets. But we see everything. They're the ones who are blind. Patience possessed a gift that no one recognized as dangerous. She could remember anything she heard, could reproduce sounds and patterns with perfect accuracy, could detect rhythms and structures in language that others couldn't perceive. Her mother, Dinah, had noticed this ability early, the way her daughter could repeat entire conversations word for word, the way she learned the Gullah dialect spoken by the coastal enslaved people within weeks of arrival, the way she seemed to hear music in ordinary speech.
System. Mantenha o fluxo e a conexão. Conecte com. E she learned the Gullah dialect spoken by the coastal enslaved people within weeks of arrival, the way she seemed to hear music in ordinary speech. But what made Patience truly remarkable wasn't just her memory. It was her understanding that language itself could be transformed into something else entirely, that words could carry meanings hidden beneath their surfaces, that communication could happen in plain sight while remaining completely invisible to those who didn't know how to listen. The seed of her system began with songs. The enslaved community at Beaumont, like communities throughout the South, used music to survive. Work songs that set rhythm for labor, spirituals that carried hope through despair, lullabies that soothed children into sleep despite the horrors surrounding them. These songs contained coded meanings that the white population generally ignored, assuming them to be simple entertainment or religious expression. But Patience heard something more. She heard structure. She heard patterns that could be expanded, complicated, made more sophisticated. She heard the possibility of a language within a language, a system of communication that could operate beneath the surface of ordinary speech. They hear us singing and think we're happy, she realized. They hear us talking and think we're simple. What if we used that blindness against them? The idea took root slowly, nurtured by observation and careful experimentation. Patience began by studying how information moved through the plantation, how news traveled between field workers and house servants, how whispers passed from cabin to cabin after dark. She mapped these networks in her mind, understanding that communication was already happening beneath the master's awareness. She simply needed to make it more sophisticated. Her first experiments were small. She developed a system of hand signals that looked like ordinary gestures, scratching an ear, adjusting a head wrap, shifting weight from foot to foot, each movement carrying specific meaning. She taught these signals to her mother first, then to a small circle of trusted women who worked alongside them. Within weeks, they could communicate silently across a crowded field, sharing information while appearing to simply work. But hand signals had limitations. They required line of sight, could only convey simple messages, and couldn't transmit complex information like routes, dates, or warnings. Patience needed something more powerful. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1851, when Patience was 13. She had been listening to the Gala language spoken by the older enslaved people, many of whom had been born in West Africa or descended from those who had. Gala blended English with words and grammatical structures from multiple African languages, creating something unique to the Carolina and Georgia coast. To white ears, it sounded like broken English, primitive and simple. They couldn't understand that it was actually more complex than English itself, carrying meanings and nuances their language lacked. They hear us singing and think we're happy, she realized. They hear us talking and think we're simple. What if we used that blindness against them? The idea took root slowly, nurtured by observation and careful experimentation. Patience began by studying how information moved through the plantation, how news traveled between field workers and house servants, how whispers passed from cabin to cabin after dark. She mapped these networks in her mind, understanding that communication was already happening beneath the master's awareness. She simply needed to make it more sophisticated. Her first experiments were small. She developed a system of hand signals that looked like ordinary gestures, scratching an ear, adjusting a head wrap, shifting weight from foot to foot, each movement carrying specific meaning. She taught these signals to her mother first, then to a small circle of trusted women who worked alongside them. Within weeks, they could communicate silently across a crowded field, sharing information while appearing to simply work. But hand signals had limitations. They required line of sight, could only convey simple messages, and couldn't transmit complex information like routes, dates, or warnings. Patience needed something more powerful. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1851, when Patience was 13. She had been listening to the Gala language spoken by the older enslaved people, many of whom had been born in West Africa or descended from those who had. Gullah blended English with words and grammatical structures from multiple African languages, creating something unique to the Carolina and Georgia coast. To white ears, it sounded like broken English, primitive and simple. They couldn't understand that it was actually more complex than English itself, carrying meanings and nuances their language lacked.
System. Patience began developing what she would later call the underneath language. It used Gullah as its base, but transformed it according to rules she created, substituting words according to complex patterns, embedding information in rhythm and tone, creating layers of meaning that required specific knowledge to decode. A simple sentence like, "The river runs high tonight," might actually mean, "Patrol on the North Road, avoid crossing until third watch." The word substitutions followed rules only initiates knew. River meant road. High meant dangerous. Tonight specified timing based on moon phases. Each element carried coded meaning, but the sentence itself sounded like ordinary observation about weather or nature. What made the system truly unbreakable was its flexibility. Patience built in the ability to shift codes based on contextual signals. A particular phrase at the beginning of a conversation indicated which substitution pattern was in use. Different patterns for different situations, different levels of urgency, different types of information. Someone who knew only one pattern couldn't decode messages using another. She also incorporated elements from African languages she learned from the older generation, words and sounds that white overseers couldn't even hear correctly, much less interpret. These elements carried crucial meaning, but to untrained ears they sounded like accent variations or verbal tics. But the most brilliant aspect of Patience's system was how she embedded it in music. The songs the enslaved community sang were already watched with some suspicion by plantation authorities, who occasionally banned particular spirituals they deemed potentially seditious. But Patience developed a method of encoding information in the musical elements themselves, in rhythm patterns, in specific melodic variations, in the way certain words were emphasized or extended. A song could be sung the same way it had always been sung, using the same lyrics everyone knew, and yet carry completely different information based on subtle variations only initiates could detect. Follow the Drinking Gourd was already known as a song about the North Star and escape, but Patience created variations that specified exact routes, safe houses, timing, and warnings. She developed Mary Don't You Weep into a complex messaging system where different verses indicated different types of information, and slight variations in how words were sung changed their meaning entirely. The system required training to use. Patience couldn't simply explain it to someone and expect them to understand. Learning the underneath language required weeks of practice, developing the ability to hear patterns that didn't exist in normal speech, memorizing substitution rules, and, most importantly, learning to communicate naturally while encoding complex information. The system. The entire chain operated in less than 6 hours, and no white person heard anything unusual. Patience found Isaiah that evening and delivered the warning, encoded in conversation that anyone overhearing would interpret as gossip about weather and livestock. Isaiah understood.
He postponed his escape, changed his route, and waited 3 more weeks until the danger had passed. When he finally left, he used information the network had gathered about patrol patterns, safe crossing points, and contacts who could help him. He reached Philadelphia 2 months later and sent word back through free black communities that connected to the network's northern terminus. Isaiah's successful escape validated everything Patience had built, but it also raised the stakes. More people wanted to use the network. More information needed to flow. And eventually, someone would notice. The first sign of danger came in early 1852. Josiah Beaumont, the plantation's owner, mentioned at dinner that he found it peculiar how the enslaved population's singing seemed to have changed recently. His overseer, a brutal man named Calloway, dismissed the observation. "They're always singing something," he said. "It means nothing." But Beaumont, more observant than his overseer, wasn't satisfied. He hired a man from Charleston who claimed expertise in managing enslaved populations, hoping for insights into what he sensed but couldn't identify. This man, whose name was Whitfield, arrived at Beaumont in February 1852 with a reputation for breaking resistance networks. He had done it before on other plantations, identifying leaders and communication methods, destroying organizing efforts through targeted violence and strategic sales. He was, in the language of the time, a specialist in managing difficult populations. Patience knew about Whitfield before he arrived. The network transmitted warnings from Charleston, from properties where he had worked before, from people who had survived his methods. She knew he was dangerous, knew he was intelligent, knew he would be watching and listening for exactly the patterns she had created. "He's coming to find us," Patience told her mother in the underneath language, their conversation sounding like a discussion about laundry to anyone listening. "We need to change everything." This was the moment that would prove Patience's genius. A less sophisticated system would have been destroyed by Whitfield's scrutiny, but Patience had built adaptation into the language itself. She activated protocols she had developed for exactly this situation, shifting code patterns, changing substitution rules, introducing new elements that made everything he might have learned about their methods obsolete. More importantly, she created what she called the surface layer, a fake communication network that used obvious symbols and simple codes designed to be discovered.
She wanted Whitfield to find something, wanted him to believe he had cracked their system, wanted him satisfied with his own cleverness while the real network continued operating underneath. The strategy worked almost too well. Within 3 weeks, Whitfield had identified the surface layer. He presented his findings to Beaumont with evident pride, explaining the simple substitution codes he had discovered, the hand signals he had observed, the pattern of who communicated with whom. He recommended punishments for the supposed ringleaders, people Patience had deliberately placed in visible positions, people who knew only the surface layer and couldn't reveal the underneath language even under torture. Beaumont was satisfied. Whitfield collected his fee and departed for his next assignment. The surface layer was dismantled, its participants punished, but not fatally, the plantation convinced that the threat had been neutralized. The real network continued operating without interruption. In fact, it expanded faster than ever during the 3 months following Whitfield's departure, because his investigation had taught Patience exactly what methods would be used against her and how to defeat them.
"They think they broke us," Patience observed to her mother, their conversation encoded in a song about crossing Jordan. "They broke nothing. They found what we wanted them to find." By summer of 1852, the network connected 12 plantations across 3 counties. It had facilitated 7 successful escapes, transmitted intelligence about patrol movements and slave catcher activities across 50 miles of territory, and created what amounted to an invisible infrastructure of resistance that no white authority suspected existed. But Patience wasn't satisfied. Individual escapes helped individuals. She wanted something larger. The plan that emerged over the summer of 1852 was unprecedented in its scope. Patience and her network would coordinate a mass escape, not from one plantation, but from 3 simultaneously, timing the departures to overwhelm the patrol capacity of the region, using diversions and misdirection to create chaos, and guiding the escapees through routes that the network had mapped over months of careful intelligence gathering. The coordination required was extraordinary. Messages had to travel between properties without any increase in communication that might attract attention. Timing had to be synchronized without any way to share written schedules. Routes had to be communicated to people who couldn't read maps and had never traveled beyond their plantation boundaries. And everything had to happen on the same night, within the same few hours, across distances that made direct coordination impossible. Patience developed new protocols for this operation. She created what she called the counting songs, musical sequences that embedded specific dates and times in their rhythm patterns. She established gathering points, locations described through coded references that only initiates could understand. She developed walking songs, melodies that actually contained navigation information, each verse corresponding to a stage of the journey, each variation indicating direction, distance, and landmarks. The operation was set for October 12, 1852, a night when the moon would be dark and the autumn weather would provide cover. 47 people across 3 plantations were prepared to move. They had been trained in navigation songs. They had memorized their routes. They had been told when to move, where to go, and what to do if separated. On the evening of October 11th, Patience transmitted the final confirmation through a spiritual sung at dusk. The song traveled from Beaumont to Ashford to Thornton, each node adding its confirmation that all was ready. To anyone listening, it was simply evening worship, enslaved people singing about heaven and freedom in the abstract religious sense that white authorities generally tolerated. But encoded in that song was precise information. Timing confirmed, routes clear, patrols mapped, departure in 12 hours. That night, Patience didn't sleep. She lay in her cabin reviewing every element of the plan, checking her memory for any detail she might have missed, any vulnerability she hadn't accounted for. Her mother lay beside her, equally awake, equally aware that the next 24 hours would determine whether their work succeeded or ended in catastrophe. "Whatever happens," Dinah whispered in the underneath language, "you've already done something they said couldn't be done. You've proven we're not what they say we are." The morning of October 12th dawned gray and overcast, perfect weather for what was planned. Patience moved through her normal routines, carrying water, helping with food preparation, showing nothing unusual in her behavior. But her mind was tracking time, counting hours until darkness, monitoring every piece of information that came through the network. At midday, a message arrived that made her blood run cold. A woman from Ashford Plantation, transmitting through song while working in fields visible from the road, indicated that unexpected visitors had arrived. A patrol from the county seat was making rounds, checking plantations in response to rumors of restlessness among enslaved populations. They were currently at Ashford. They would likely visit Beaumont next. Their presence would disrupt everything. Patience had to make a decision immediately. Delay the operation? Proceed despite the risk? Try to warn the other nodes to adjust timing? Each option carried dangers. Delay might mean the plan was discovered. Proceeding might mean running directly into patrols. Attempting to change coordinated timing across 3 plantations with hours to go was nearly impossible.
System. She chose a fourth option, one that demonstrated why her system was more than just codes and substitutions. It was a living network capable of adaptation. Through a series of rapid transmissions, Patience sent instructions to accelerate the Thornton departure while delaying Beaumont and Ashford. The Thornton group would move 3 hours early, while the patrol was occupied elsewhere. Their movement might draw attention north, pulling patrols in that direction. Meanwhile, Beaumont and Ashford would wait until the patrol had passed, then move south on a secondary route the network had mapped but never planned to use. The messages went out through work songs, through conversations near property boundaries, through a child who was sent on an errand that took her close enough to the Ashford fields to sing a particular verse that carried crucial timing information. Within 2 hours, all 3 nodes had received updated instructions. The patrol arrived at Beaumont in late afternoon. Patience watched them from the kitchen where she worked, counting their numbers, noting their weapons, observing their horses. They spoke with Calloway, the overseer, asking routine questions about recent disturbances or unusual behavior. Calloway answered with the contempt he showed toward everyone, assuring them that his people knew their place and gave no trouble. The patrol departed as dusk approached, heading north toward Thornton, exactly as Patience had anticipated. She waited until they were out of sight, then transmitted the final go signal through a song that sounded like evening prayer. At Thornton, 21 people had already been moving for 2 hours, following routes encoded in songs they had memorized over weeks of preparation. They traveled in 3 groups, each taking different paths that would converge at a gathering point 15 miles north. The early departure meant they had a significant head start before anyone realized they were gone. At Beaumont and Ashford, the remaining 26 people began moving at full dark, following the secondary southern route. This path was longer, more difficult, but it avoided the areas where patrols concentrated their attention. They traveled in family groups where possible, Patience having insisted that the operation wouldn't separate parents from children when it could be avoided. Patience herself was among the last to leave Beaumont. Her role required staying until she was certain all transmissions had been received, all groups had departed, all elements of the plan were in motion. Her mother waited with her, refusing to leave without her daughter, despite Patience's arguments that Dinah should go with an earlier group. "I didn't raise you to leave behind," Dinah said in the underneath language. "We go together or not at all." System, system, system. Today, the site is partially occupied by a housing development. No historical marker notes what occurred there. No memorial commemorates the 47 people who escaped through the genius of a teenage girl who turned language into liberation. But in archives scattered across the South, fragments remain. Songs that were recorded by folklorists in the early 20th century, collected from elderly people who had learned them from their parents, carry melodic variations that don't quite fit standard patterns. Hand gestures described in narrative accounts of plantation life don't match any practical purpose. Linguistic patterns in Gullah communities include elements that scholars can't trace to African or English origins. These fragments are all that remain of what Patience built. A communication system so sophisticated it has never been fully reconstructed. A network so secure that its methods remain partially unknown more than a century and a half later. A testament to intelligence that the system of slavery depended on denying existed. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about resistance, intelligence, and the human refusal to accept oppression, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. What Patience Carter accomplished wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was human intelligence applied with extraordinary precision to an impossible situation. She proved that the mind cannot be enslaved, even when the body is. She proved that systems built on the assumption of black inferiority were fundamentally vulnerable to black genius they couldn't recognize or comprehend. The slaveholders at Beaumont thought they owned everything: the land, the rice, the people who worked both. But they never owned Patience's mind. They never owned the patterns she perceived, the systems she created, the networks they built. They never owned the underneath language that operated for years directly beneath their observation. They heard her sinning and thought she was content. They heard her speaking and thought she was simple. They never understood a single word. And 47 people walked to freedom on a bridge built from sounds the masters couldn't decode. Remember her. Remember all of them. Remember that the people history tried to define as property were always, in every way that matters, fully human, fully capable, and, in ways that still humble us, fully brilliant. The codes are gone now, lost to time and the death of those who knew them. But what they represented endures. The unconquerable human spirit. The refusal to accept that power determines worth. The knowledge that intelligence, creativity, and determination can defeat systems designed to crush them. Patience Carter spoke in codes her masters couldn't break, and her voice still echoes if we know how to listen. Until next time.